Hello, Potomac Crossing Ward. This is the 2021 Doctrine and Covenants 20 through 22. Come follow me, lesson number 10. So we're covering Doctrine and Covenants 20, 21, and 22. All three of these sections of text are dealing with the church and how to run the church, the organization of the church, and how to do things the right way. So, Doctrine and Covenants, section 20. This section deals with the organization and governance of the church. It's divided into halves. Verses 1 through 36 present the doctrine of the church, and verses 36 through 84 present the application of the doctrine, or the institution and bureaucracy of the ecclesiastical body. Now, ecclesiastical hierarchies and bureaucracies were established anciently as well. If we take a look at Exodus chapter 18, verses 17 through 26, there's plenty of places in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament where the Lord is organizing the people in various ways in order to run an efficient bureaucracy so that things can get done. Now, the text of Doctrine and Covenants, section 20, is of the variety of scripture that falls under the inspired writings category. There are no quotations of the Lord. The authors write in the first person as well as the third person. So in verse 5 we see the first person, and then in verse 6 we see the third person. And there are a number of confidence statements given. We see that in verses 17, 29, 31, and 35. This indicates the author knew what he was writing was true and inspired, but was being written in his own words by his own hand. Hence the difference in composition and content when compared with the other sections, which are quotations of the Lord, which we see in Doctrine and Covenants section 19 and 21, or heavenly visions, like when we see in Doctrine and Covenants 76. The content of the present text is largely composed of preceding revelations and sections of the Book of Mormon. The original draft of this text was likely written by Oliver Cowdery sometime during 1829. How heavily the original draft was subsequently edited by Smith is unclear, but there's clear evidence that Smith did edit it. As we go through the text, a lot of it is pretty straightforward, and I'm not going to comment too much on it. I do want to talk a little bit about some of the history of the text. Early in the church's history, the text of this section was read over the pulpit at all conferences and various large meetings. As the church was starting out, regulation of such matters as addressed herein was certainly a primary concern until the people came to understand and practice them. Its prominent appearance as the first thing published in the Evening and Morning Star emphasizes its importance. So this is a duplication, a reprint of the Evening and Morning Star, and the text of section 20 is this entire section through here, and then here starts section 22. So the entire thing here is taking up the entire first page of the very first printing of the Evening and Morning Star. So it's clear that the church's goal here is to set everybody on this, kind of level the playing field, get everybody on the same page, literally, in the case of the Evening and Morning Star anyway, so that everybody knows what's expected and how the church is supposed to be organized. So in the comments on section 20, I include a number of historical comments, and I also include one of the quotes that Smith wrote about in the conflict that he had with Oliver Cowdery over some edits that were going to be made there, and it does shed a little bit of light on some of Cowdery's arrogance that became a problem later. I also include a comparison of the original 1833 Book of Commandments text with the amended 1835 version. So this section of text, Doctrine and Covenants 20, changes a lot over time, and there's a lot of it's unlike any of the other sections in the Doctrine and Covenants how much it changes in its various manuscripts and the way it's published through the Book of Commandments and the Doctrine and Covenants, as well as its appearances in Times and Seasons and the Millennial Star. The text changes a lot. The changes are not substantive, meaning there's no real change in substance. What it is they're changes in clarity, because they want people, when they're reading it, to understand what they're what's being communicated to them. And we see this very much in the difference between the 1833 Book of Commandments version and the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants version. There are significant changes, and all of the changes are for clarity, so that the people will understand what is trying to be communicated. I also include a lengthy discussion over the scrolling down here. Bear with me. Over the sacrament prayers. So here the sacrament prayers are canonized in the Doctrine and Covenants, which are largely the same as them appearing in the Book of Mormon. So I include a discussion on the sacrament prayers, on the similarity and the differences between the prayer over the bread and the water, and what the differences and the similarities show as far as the covenant and the theology embedded in the sacrament prayers. So if you want to do a little bit more reading on the sacrament prayers, I recommend you take a look at that. And then I also include a discussion on the doctrine of salvation. In section 20, verses 19 through I believe it's 21, there's a very brief and condensed statement about soteriology, or the doctrine of salvation, and the presentation is eminently biblical. In that, the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants agree 100% with the biblical view, the New Testament view of the doctrine of salvation. So, at the end of my comments on section 20, I discuss the New Testament doctrine of salvation and how it lines up very closely with what's said in Doctrine and Covenants section 20, and it explains justification, sanctification, exaltation, and the semantic differences that we have as members of the church with other members who tend to focus on grace, where we tend to focus, or justification by grace, where we tend to focus on sanctification by works and exaltation when you endure to the end. So the intent here with that essay is to help people eliminate the semantic differences, so that when you're having the conversation with people, it doesn't devolve into contention, so that you can understand how the word saved is used in the scriptures, because it's used 5 different ways. So when you're having these kinds of conversations with people who say, oh, you Mormons, you're works-based, then we can explain to them what the scriptures are talking about when they talk about grace versus works. And so that we can understand that, and we can turn the conversation into a teaching moment instead of a contention, instead of a contentious exchange. So that's at the bottom of the comments on section 20. Okay, moving on to section 21. This section of text establishes the relationship between Smith as the prophet and the ecclesia, meaning the body of the church. So in verses 1 through 3, it talks about Smith. In verses 4 through 6, it's talking about the ecclesia. Verses 7 through 8, Smith. Verses 9, the ecclesia. In verses 10, and the first line of verse 11 is talking about Smith. And then verses 11b through 12 are talking about the ecclesia. So it's saying, as the Lord chooses Smith as his prophet, then we, the ecclesia, have to act accordingly because this is his chosen servant. So it alternates back and forth, and just as Moses was to Israel, Smith is to, or was to the ecclesia, or even is to the ecclesia, because he is the Lord's prophet, and we need to acknowledge him as such. And as he acts in that capacity, then we have to pay attention and act accordingly. So this formalizes his role as leader of the church. Now, there's a little bit of historical material on section 21. So at the time the church was officially incorporated, there were 6 official members, as the number was limited by regulation. But there were about 50 people present for the first meeting, composed of baptized members and friends. So the number was limited because in the state of New York, you were allowed to have, I believe it's between 3 and 9 members when the church was officially set up. So Smith came in with 6. So the state law under which the Church of Christ was incorporated was entitled an Act to Provide for the Incorporation of Religious Societies. Passed the 5th of April 1813, the law which stipulated that a certificate of incorporation be recorded with the county clerk designated that, quote, any number of discrete persons of their church, not less than 3 nor exceeding 9, could transact all affairs relative to the temporalities thereof, close quote. So the number that they came up with was according to the laws of New York and no other reason. So, yeah, that kind of lays it out. And then there's a few other comments there, and then, yeah, that's about it. Some of the other background history for the church. And then section 22. This section regulates the necessity of performing or reperforming baptisms, and this would include any sort of ordinance with the appropriate priesthood authority. Now, we take this for granted today, but then it was a point of discussion over whether people needed to be baptized again. So this revelation makes it clear that the outward ecclesiastical act, in this case baptism, is not sufficient. The appropriate priesthood authority must be invoked as well, necessitating rebaptism for people. And there's an interesting historical comment. The only contemporary comment we get is from Orson Pratt, and he is quoted in Lyndon Cook's Revelations of the Prophet Joseph Smith, and I'll go ahead and read the quote. In the early days of this church, there were certain persons belonging to the Baptist denomination, very moral and no doubt as good people as you could find anywhere, who came saying they believed in the Book of Mormon and that they had been baptized into the Baptist church, and they wished to come into our church. The prophet Joseph had not at that time particularly inquired in revelation to this matter, but he did inquire and received a revelation from the Lord, which is section 22. These Baptists had to be rebaptized. There was no other way to get into this church. And that's a quotation from Journal of Discourses, volume 16, pages 293 to 294. So, and again, that is quoted in the Evening and Morning Star. This last little section is added on there over the necessity of people being rebaptized. So that is, kind of laying down the order of the church. So these 3 sections, 20, 21, and 22, are matters of ecclesiastical bureaucracy. Yes, there's some theology touched on, obviously, but the goal here with these sections is really to regulate and to organize the church so that it's functioning effectively and people know what's to be expected of them. Very early on in the church, that's a very important thing. When the church moves from New York to Kirtland, it's clear that a lot of the early converts in the church bring a lot of their religious practices, a lot of their baggage with them into the church, and it ends up causing some problems that need to be dealt with. So, regulating the church, regulating the ecclesiastical bureaucracy and what is expected of people was important in setting up a culture and setting up their society at that time. And that's the beginning of that is what we see here in these sections 20, 21, and 22. And that wraps it up for this lesson.